Hey guys, RDD2 here. So just before I start with this video is specified to help those who are picking a CPU for the desktop computer. Also, I won't use laptop CPUs for comparison since they have different features and some of them are listed here. So without further ado, let's start with the video. Even if you're a novice or a beginner when it comes to CPUs, this video would help you to decide or at least narrow down your choices of which CPU you should get. To start things off, you as a consumer should factor in how much you are willing to pay and what programs you'll be using on your computer, whether you'll be using it for video editing, gaming, streaming, or just a casual browse on the internet. But which one should you choose to complement your needs? The first time I started looking at CPUs and as an naive customer, I've always thought that the more cores and threads the CPU have that would normally translate to a better performance. But obviously there are other underlying factors such as the CPU's gigahertz, threads, thermal design power or TDP, advancement in technology and all those other technical stuff. But before moving on, just a basic explanation on these stated factors as I'll be referring to them later on. Firstly, the meaning of gigahertz is that it measures clock speed rate at which a processor executes a task. Threads on the other hand act as a lane that's connected to the CPU core where data are processed, or in other words, where your programs are processed. Also, there's a thing called hyperthreading which uses two threads that allows data processing to be quicker. Moreover, TDP is the maximum amount of heat a CPU can generate that the cooling system in the computer is designed to dissipate in a typical operation. And lastly, newer generation of CPUs thanks to the advancement in technology, CPUs has become more efficient in terms of processing data, so now they can do more with less. Now to the important question, should you choose AMD or Intel to complement your needs? There's been a lot of debate on which manufacturer is better, but based on the market share of both companies in the last 10 years, Intel has been a leading CPU provider, nearly doubling or tripling their market share compared to AMD. But before you jump into conclusion and just pick an Intel CPU based on this statistic alone, I'll be comparing these CPUs which range from low to high-end processors as my sample. The reason why I chose them is purely because I wanted to pick an AMD and Intel processors that have a nearly similar price as shown from Newegg.com. First, on the bottom of the performance ladder, and the example is the Intel Celeron G390 with 2 cores, no hyperthreading, and runs at 2.9 GHz. While the other one is the Intel Pentium G4 560 with 2 core with hyperthreading and runs at 3.5 GHz. While the AMD equivalent is the A4 7300 with 2 cores, no hyperthreading and runs at 3.8 GHz clock speed and 4 GHz in turbo speed. While the other is the A10 9700 with quad core with hyperthreading and runs at 3.5 GHz clock speed and 3.8 GHz turbo speed. Now, this is a great example of why you shouldn't let the high core clock fool you. Even it seems that AMD is better than Intel CPUs by looking at their clock speed from this sample. But based on the performance as shown from CPU that use a benchmark, the G390 have a faster effective speed by 46% than its rival. While the other pair, the G4 560 and A10 9700, the G4 560 have a faster effective speed by 16% than its rival. Looking at the release dates of these CPUs, the Intel processors are more recently released than AMD processors. Also, based on their prices, there's really not much difference and Intel has a lower TDP. Clearly, in my opinion, Intel would be a better choice based on this information alone. But why should you choose a low-end processor? Typically, they are used for internet browsing, low CPU usage applications such as this example, and entry level for gaming in some games such as this list on low settings, and some can be put in medium settings such as these games. If your needs fit in that category, then maybe you should consider a low-end processor. Now moving on towards the midpoint of the ladder, and the sample for Intel is the i3 and i5 processors with examples such as the i3 7100 with 2 cores with hyperthreading and runs at 3.9 GHz, while the other is the i5 7600 quad core with hyperthreading and base clock speed of 3.8 GHz and 4.1 GHz turbo speed, while the AMD equivalent is the Ryzen 3 1200 quad core with no hyperthreading and base clock speed of 3.5 GHz and 3.7 GHz turbo speed, while the other one is the Ryzen 5 1600 with 6 core with hyper-threading and runs at 3.2 GHz and 3.6 turbo speed. Now to compare the i3 with the Ryzen 3 and the i5 with the Ryzen 5. The Ryzen 3 has a 6% effective speed than the i3. However, on the overall performance as seen in this image, the desktop would show how fast a single core of a CPU can perform tasks such as surfing the internet, email, office apps, and music or video playback. The i3 is better in this category than the Ryzen 3 by 5%. But in terms of gaming, the Ryzen 3 has a slight advantage of 4%, while the workstation would show how fast a multi-core of a CPU can perform things like number crunching, databases, and audio or video encoding. On this category, the Ryzen 3 wins by 4%. Now moving on to the other pair, which is the i5 7600 and the Ryzen 5 1600. The i5 has a faster effective speed by 9% than the Ryzen 5. So a more in-depth analysis on the performance, based on this result, the gaming performance of the i5 has a 7% advantage and a 6% advantage on its single core speed as seen in the desktop category. However, the Ryzen 5 has a faster multi-core speed by 21%. To break everything down, as a consumer, you should decide which one can benefit you the most and how much you are willing to spend. Based on this result, if you're picking between the i3 7100 and Ryzen 3 1200, and if your primary purpose is to game and encode audio or videos, then you may want to consider Ryzen 3. Plus, it's a bit cheaper, but you may have to sacrifice since it has a slightly higher TDP. While a comparison with the i5 7600 and Ryzen 5 1600, if you're mostly going to play games, then the i5 will be a better choice. But if you'll be using programs that require your CPU to perform high number crunching tasks, then a Ryzen 5 will be more ideal. Now, before moving on to the high-end processors, if you want to know more where I got these statistics that I've used to compare the CPUs, I'll post a link down in the description for you guys to read. Moving on the top of the ladder, and the sample will be the i7 7700 with quad-core, with hyper-thread and run at 3.6 GHz base clock speed and 4.2 GHz turbo speed. While the AMD equivalent is the Ryzen 7 1700 with octa-core with hyper-threading and runs at 3 GHz base clock speed and 3.7 GHz turbo speed. Now, this is where you can boast about having a sexier PC than your friend in terms of its performance and tease them for having a potato. But again, don't forget that you're buying a CPU in terms of what programs you'll be using and how much you're willing to pay. These CPUs are one of the best out in the market, and they are catered for people who want to play most games on high or ultra settings and render things such as videos on a faster speed, as just one of the few examples. The effective speed shows that the i7 is faster by 5%, while for the gaming and desktop category, the i7 has a slight advantage over the Ryzen 7 by 4 and 5%. But with the workstation category, the Ryzen 7 has the slight advantage with 27%. In conclusion, both processors have the same TDP and their prices are nearly similar, so it will mostly come down on which one would you prefer having in terms of the features. The i7 is a better processor when it comes down to gaming, but the Ryzen 7 will have a better performance in terms of things like audio or video encoding. Nonetheless, I know I didn't talk about overclocking, but don't worry, I'll make sure that I'll make a video about it soon. Before finishing off this video, a few more tips that I can give you guys are: firstly, buy a motherboard that's compatible with your chosen CPU. This seems to be a no-brainer, but you wouldn't want a product that won't fit with your build. To illustrate, this CPU shows what type of socket they need to be paired with a motherboard. So when you buy a CPU, make sure it fits with the motherboard socket. Secondly, if you're not buying a dedicated graphics card, make sure your CPU has an integrated graphics so that your build can post a display on your monitor. But a dedicated graphics card will be more ideal if you're using it for things like gaming. And lastly, if you know someone that's close to you that has a PC, you probably may want to buy the same CPU chipset that they have. It's really up to you if you want to do that, but the main reason for it is because if your PC encounters boot errors, you can ask your friend to use their CPU and use it on your setup so you can diagnose if your CPU needs to be fixed or replaced. This method can save you tons of money because of things like a fee for diagnosing your PC from somebody else. Anyways guys, thank you so much if you watched this video, and I hope that it helped you guys to decide or at least narrow down your choices on picking your CPU. If it did, please make sure you give a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification for more upcoming tech videos.